we go. Good morning. Welcome to our webinar on the Civilian Conservation Corp, otherwise referred to as the CCC. Before we get started today, I just wanted to let you know that we have a webinar coming up tomorrow on maple syrup production. You can find information on that on our website under our virtual programming webpage or on our Facebook page. If you miss anything, you can go to our YouTube channel and just search OhioDNR on the YouTube page, and you will find all of our archived videos that we've done over the past several months. And if you miss anything today, you can find this one on there too. So I'll put those links in the Q&A box so you have them, but I want to introduce our guest speakers today. I have with me Ann Schweitzer. Hi, Ann. And Kyle Casey. And Kyle's going to kick off our presentation. Please utilize the Q&A box if you have any questions. Myself and my coworkers, Cindy and Bill, are here with me in the background. We'll answer any questions that you might have. So go ahead, Kyle, you can kick it off.
Okay. Well, today we're going to be discussing the Civilian Conservation Corp, better known to most as the CCC. Now, before we can really get into the who and the why of the program, we really have to set the stage to get a better understanding of what life was like for Ohioans and all Americans everywhere at that time period. So that's the only really way to get a deeper appreciation for all the improvements and projects completed by the CCC that, would become the foundation for today's Ohio State Park System when we were eventually established in 1949. So let's rewind back to 1920. I'll go ahead and hit that slide there. So it's the beginning of the Roaring 20s. So during this decade, United States, we were looking good, right? Total wealth of the country had doubled. America had more widely access to electricity, and that created the possibility of mass production, which skyrocketed. Companies like the Ford Motor Companies, they were able to produce parts for their vehicles on a much larger scale, which allowed for many more jobs to be available all across the board. Now that companies could produce more goods on a larger scale, those companies could grow in value as a result. So now, with more money to get, people across Ohio and throughout the United States wanted to get a piece of that pie. So many started investing in these different growing companies, from janitors, teachers, millionaires, just trying to get more millions. There was one place that everyone went to for these investments: the stock market. So the economy grew and grew and grew, but with a failing agricultural sector, we had rising debt, large bank loans, and really small, meager wages. The growth was always doomed to collapse. So that brings us to October 29th, 1929, otherwise known as Black Tuesday, right? That's when the stock market collapsed. Billions of dollars were lost, wiping out thousands of investors. The entire country, it just spiraled downward into the deepest and longest lasting economic downturn in the history of the Western industrialized world at the time. So that is where the Roaring 20s officially end and the Great Depression begins. So during the Great Depression, jobless men everywhere struggled to earn enough money to buy food for their families. The country's youth, the situation was equally desperate. Right, you had hundreds of thousands of young men from economically stricken households that searched in vain for work. Finding work was pretty much impossible. Most spent time traveling great distances looking for any kind of work. Unemployment rates were around 30%. You had 300,000 vagrant youth, mostly men, that lived on the roads and by the railroads by 1933. And unfortunately for African Americans, this time period was doubly hard on them, as they were typically the last to be hired and the first to be fired for pretty much any jobs in the country, more than doubling the black unemployment rate versus the white unemployment rate during the Great Depression. So now we're going to look at this bleak backdrop and move over to our newly elected president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And he announced March 1933 for the creation of the Civilian Conservation Corp, which was an agency aimed at conserving the nation's depleted and natural resources and putting unemployed youth back to work. Roosevelt's election was based on his far-reaching plan to establish the nation in a record 100 days. So he has a very famous quote, and we're going to read it here on the slide. that he said during his acceptance speech on July 2nd of 1932, which is, I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people. So on March 9th, 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt called Congress into an emergency session to authorize that revitalization plan. It included the Emergency Conservation Work Act, the ECW, which created the CCC. Despite opposition, the president signed the act into law on the 31st. He promised that by July, 250,000 men would be employed in a peacetime army to win the nation's abused, neglected, and eroded national resources. With speed and cooperation all over the board, the plans were proposed, authorized, and implemented in only 37 days of the inauguration. So we're going to go over of all the New Deal programs, right, instituted by Roosevelt, that were put into place to combat the economic hardships of the Great Depression. Probably none was as popular and successful as the CCC. Right, so CCC, it was meant to help combat the effects of the Great Depression by providing work and wages and room and board to the young men struggling to make a living. They had two main objectives. One was to find immediate and useful conservation work for unemployed young men. The second one was to provide vocational training and later education training for the enrollees. The CCC projects, they were managed by the Department of the Interior and the Department of Agriculture, which has the National Park Service and the Forest Service. And the projects that they did could be divided into 5 primary categories, right? There was reforestation, we've got construction of the recreational areas, soil conservation, emergency and natural disaster aid, and wildlife management. So the wide variety of government projects often focused on infrastructural improvements like road construction, flood control, reforestation, a lot of soil erosion prevention. The CCC workers also improved features across the country's local, state, and national parks, from trails, shelter houses, latrines, to tunnels, roadway bridges, and telephone lines. Really, all in all, there was over 300 different types of projects. And many of these improvements and the work by the CCC are now part of our 75 Ohio state parks. So it was thought, that the CCC would fix the broken morale of the country from the Great Depression. It would help form men who were strong with good work ethic and were independently minded that could serve as a foundation for generations to come. Originally, the CCC was only open to unemployed men between 18 and 25, but later it expanded to men from 17 to 28. And over its 9 years of existence, the CCC employed nearly 3 million men, and at its peak, over 500,000 were enrolled at the same time. They were made up of all races, but workers were segregated into units based on their race. Within a short time, the CCC camps had been established across the country, and the young men were recruited to work on a myriad of conservation projects. And there we go. So the first 6 months of the first 6 months of the operation, it was not uncommon for CCC companies to be housed in surplus army temps like these. Here's one example. This next slide is going to be another example of those tents. So permanent camp buildings, they were later constructed. By 1934, the CCC, they were boasting that tent life was going to be a thing of the past, as they had hired thousands of carpenters, utilizing millions of board feet for lumber. They would be building permanent and portable camp structures throughout the United States. The first CCC camp in Ohio was established in southern Ohio at the Scioto Trail State Forest in May of 1933. Eventually, workers would be based in dozens of camps all across the state. Some of the buildings that would have been present in the camps would have been a blacksmith shop, a tool shed, multiple garages. There was barracks for the enrollees, staff and officer quarters. There had been a first aid, a medical station, a mess hall. We had reading rooms, latrines, shower houses, the administration offices, trade buildings. There was always a recreational building as well. So the operation, right, the daily life, the operation of the CCC took its cue from the U.S. military, right? The workers lived in camps, they wore uniforms, they served under the command of officers. Their monthly wages were set at about $30 a month, which was, there's about 25 of it was sent back to their families. Today, that would have been around $570 a month, and 470 would go back home to the family, and they would keep about $100 a month for themselves. They were a lot of the times referred to as the dollar a day boys, because their earning essentially came out to be about $1 per day, which today would be about $20 a day. But the cost of living for the men was kept low, because the CCC covered basic expenses like the food, clothing, housing. At the time, it was actually not uncommon for the young people to contribute their wages back to their families before they were married and formed their own household. So that's why the CCC incorporated that as a requirement of the program. Now, earlier you heard me call them boys. That was not a derogatory term by any means. Most of the men of the CCC were referred to as boys because the majority of the men that joined were very young, between around 17 to 20 years old, and officially they were called juniors. Many of the boys that started in the early days of the CCC were very underweight. They were undernourished, around 70% of them, because of the Great Depression that they were living in. The CCC offered these boys experiences that they never had before, right? For the majority of them, it was their first time ever even leaving home. So after enrolling, on average, the hard work and military-style structured routines made those boys gain over 11 pounds in the first 3 to 4 months on the job. Also, most of the boys that enrolled were illiterate and had very little knowledge of sanitation routines. So while they were enrolled, not only was all this changed, but most had actually learned to read and learned at least one trade, and many of them even received their high school equivalency degree. The enrollees, they had several obligations outside of their work duties also. They had weekly lectures, personal hygiene, safety, and etiquette. Saturday mornings were often spent on camp maintenance, while afternoons and the evenings brought around a number of recreational activities. You know, they had the occasional dances held in camp. On special nights, they would actually take a camp truck into town for an evening out. To see a movie at the time cost around 10 cents, about $2 a day. And then if the men lived close enough on weekends that they had both Saturday and Sunday off completely, it really wasn't uncommon for them to head home to visit family as long as they were back in time. A typical day for these CCC boys began with flag raising at 6 a.m. After a round of calisthenics, hearty breakfast, barracks, and grounds cleanup, the enrollees left for their work assignments around 7:45, just before 8 o'clock. Lunch was often served in the field, and the men were back in camp by 4 o'clock. After cleaning up and lowering the flag at 5, they would assemble for their evening meal, and then after their meal till 10 p.m. for lights out, they were free to attend classes, read, learn a trade, have fun in the rec hall, whatever they wanted. It was their time. All right. And now we're looking at a lot of these pictures. A lot of them are black and white. They're living in a Great Depression that we've never experienced. And sometimes it might feel hard to connect with people from a different time. It's important to remember that these boys were no different than you or I today when it comes down to it. For instance, the CCC men located at camps in the Hocking Hills region that we'll take a look at later would often watch movies on a weekly basis, both the camps and at a local rural theater in Logan. Though they did not call them movies at the time, they would say that they were talkies or picture shows. Sometimes the shows were granted as a reward for good work around the camps. The camps, sometimes they would be educational films provided by different places, like the forestry department, for example. They would donate films for the men to enjoy, and they were always well liked, but sometimes the movies were purely just for pleasure with no education behind them. One example, Victor Hugo's timeless book, Les Mis. It was one of the films that the men would enjoy on occasion, and on Monday night, October 5th, 1936, that's exactly what the men of the Hocking Hills were doing to relax after a good hard day of work. These men aren't so different from people today in that way, you know. So as we all still love going to the movies when we can. If you ever want to try and really feel connected to the CCC and its past without going too much out of your way, just this coming Monday night, cozy up on your couch, bowl of popcorn, and watch the 1935 version of Les Mis, and you can kind of form a connection to that CCC past. All right, so we're going to focus more on the CCC in Ohio a little bit now. So the CCC was active for 9 years. Ohio began with 9 camps in 1933. It grew to a high of 35 camps across the state operating at one time. On average, though, throughout those 9 years, there was about 33 camps active at once overall. tracking the movements of the different camps that's been closed now for nearly 80 years can be a super hard task, especially when you take into account that though every camp was given a specific designation, which is typically a letter and a number, any camp could be formed in one area, then moved to another area without changing the camp number. As well, camps could be terminated and reformed into a new camp with a new number. By just over 2 weeks into the start of the program on April 22nd of 33, Ohio already had over 12,000 enrollees in those first camps, and by July it had increased to over 75,000 enrollees. Of those camps, there were 24 all-white integrated camps, and there were 9 of the all-black camps. In the first 2 years, most camps were racially integrated. But after that 2-year period, most all of the camps were segregated by race. Few exceptions did exist, but in those camps, typically only around 3 African Americans were present in a camp of 200 men. Racial separation was never intended with the CCC, but since the camps were such a big part of the local towns they were near, and individual camps were administered on the state level, not the federal level, the organization also felt that hand of injustice, especially in more of the southern states. A few other exceptions did exist, where you would have black workers and white workers working together, but that was only in areas that did not have a high population of African Americans and did not justify the numbers to create an entirely new camp. And really only 2 camps in Region 9, which is what Ohio was a part of, had integrated camps that had predominantly black enrollees. Overall, African American involvement in the CCC was capped at around 10% of total recruits, which at the time was the rough equivalent of the African American population in the United States. With black unemployment rate reaching around 50% in the United States just before the initiation of the CCC, many eligible black men were unfortunately turned away due to the cap that if white would have received the relief.
Okay, then I'm going to jump in here. We're going to talk about where you can see the CCC today, what work survives. The gift that the 3C left us more than 80 years ago was to shape and restore the wilderness into the state parks we have today. Some outstanding examples of well-preserved 3C projects are still welcoming visitors to many of Ohio State's parks. The 3C structures include residential cabins, dining halls, picnic shelters, bridges, and much, much more. Can't really talk about structures made by the 3C without addressing parkitecture. A lot of the structures made by the 3C have the style that's nicknamed parkitecture, a combination of park and architecture. This style was developed in the early 20th century, and it's a concept that's the foundation of the 3C's work. And it's found throughout Ohio, and many other parks where the 3C work still contain examples of parkitecture today. Parkitecture is known for utilizing local materials with local character to create visually appealing structures that fit into their natural surroundings. The distinctive rustic style became the backbone of structures and buildings throughout the national park and many state park systems throughout the United States. So here we have an example of parkitecture, and you can see the rough cut logs, and this was used just to be a well cover. This is another great example of parkitecture, and this you can actually find at Mohican State Park. This shelter house was constructed by the 3C in the 1930s. It's made of native wood and native sandstone. And as I said, parkitecture is known for its rustic appearance, but rustic doesn't mean primitive. This shelter house actually features 2 massive fireplaces on either end, and it has sweeping views of the forest. And the picture in the upper left-hand corner is one of those giant fireplaces made out of like native stone. Here's a shelter house down at Rock House in the Hocking area. The picture on the left is from 1934, and the picture on the right was taken just a few weeks ago. You can see how well this structure has held up over almost 100 years. But it wasn't just the buildings and structures that the 3C created. 3C labor also transformed entire landscapes. Crews dammed streams to create lakes and diligently planted trees to reclaim indigenous forest. Armed with little more than shovels and determination, 3C crews planted large swaths of forest at Finley, John Bryan, Mohican, Pike Lake, and Shawnee, just to name a few places. Okay, now we're going to dive into some more sites to showcase the 3C's work that remains. Okay, our first stop is Pike Lake State Park. Pike Lake began to take shape during the 3C days. One of the Ohio's camps was established near the future site of Pike Lake at Morgantown, Ohio. Corps members dug the lake by hand, built 2 of the 3 fire towers in the area, and constructed the roads to make them accessible. They also planted hundreds of pine trees to help with erosion. Many 3C projects also included the removal of dead American chestnut. The American chestnut was ravaged by blight in the early 20th century. Forests in Ohio were left with giant stands of, it was called standing deadwood. These are just, the trees are dead, but they haven't fallen over yet. The standing trunks of the dead chestnut tree became host to the chestnut timberworm, a boring insect. As deadwood stands were harvested, they appeared to have holes and lines throughout the wood, and this was given the nickname wormy chestnut. So in these pictures, we have in the upper left-hand corner, a stand of dead chestnut trees. On the upper right-hand corner, that's a picture of the fungus which caused the chestnut blight. And then, excuse me, in the bottom corner, that's an example of wormy chestnut. This wood is, at first, it wasn't popular and they just burned a lot of it. I mean, you look at it, it has the marks from where the bug bore in there and people didn't like it. They thought it was a defect. Then in the 1950s, it started to become really, really popular. And today it's really expensive and really rare. So it's pretty neat that so many of the structures today have been made out of that. So here's a picture at Camp Zaleski down in Ohio, and they're making lumber out of all the dead chestnut that they've salvaged. This picture is from like 1936, I think. Okay, and then using this salvaged timber, the 3C built several log structures such as Pike Lake State Park's Group Lodge. And this is a prized souvenir of the 3C days. It once served as the residency for the Pike 3C camp directors and still has original floor-to-ceiling wood paneling created from wormy chestnut, which was salvaged by the 3C. The American chestnut is a very, very hardy wood, which is why so many of the 3C structures survive to today. Even the structures that have been kept outside have still survived because chestnut was so hardy. And the group lodge at Pike Lake is literally filled with this wormy chestnut. I mean, the picture in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see everything in that lodge is wood paneling. It is so cool. Okay, then we're going to go to John Bryan State Park. The 3C arrived at John Bryan in June 1935 to begin 6 years of work. The men laid out roadways and blazed miles of trail, as well as created the 2 footbridges across the Little Miami River. The 3C also established the park office, picnic shelter, and the day lodge. So here's a photograph of the shelter house being constructed in the 1930s. There's another picture of it completed. And here's a picture from either the 1930s or 40s of people picnicking in front of the completed shelter house. And then if we go today, there's the exact same shelter house. So you can literally recreate pictures from the 40s. Okay, and then at John Bryan, there's also the Day Lodge. This is a big building with also has wood paneling, chestnut, and then also this massive stone fireplace created from native stone too. And then, like I said, 3C also blazed trails. Here's an example of some trails in the 30s and that same trail today. And the 3C also preserved, I mean, we talk about the 3C as their history to us. They ended up preserving a fragment of a 19th century stagecoach road in John Bryan State Park. It's now called the Pittsburgh-Cincinnati Stagecoach Trail within the park. And because of the 3C, this road now exists for another type of public use. Travelers will find that traffic over it is even slower than it was in the 19th century, since they don't have coaches to drive over it, you have to walk over it. But that's pretty cool that they preserved history. To them, that was like over 100 years ago. And now today, we're trying to preserve stuff that they've created 80 to 90 years ago. We also have footbridges that they constructed, and some of these have been reconstructed. And then there's the footbridges today. Okay, and then our next stop is Mohican State Park. When the boys of Company 1530, Camp Mohican, first arrived, there were areas of land that were bare of trees due to farming in the area. In the hilly country, like areas of Mohican, the naked cropland was susceptible to erosion. To prevent more erosion, the 3C planted over 200,000 saplings to hold the land in place. Okay, and here's one area where they planted saplings, and this is that area today. They moved an iron bridge from upstream in an area that was about to be flooded to cross the Clear Fork, and an area where the covered bridge now is today. So this is where they moved the bridge, and that bridge no longer exists, but in its place, there's this covered bridge that was put there. And this is called Hog Hollow Bridge. In many ways, the creation of this, relocating the bridge here, opened the gorge and made it more accessible. And this led to creating the facilities and infrastructure that makes the park what it is today. As we mentioned in an earlier slide, the park shelter that is located at Mohican State Park is another 3C site worth seeing. Okay, and then something else that's really neat is the Gorge Overlook Trail. Members of the Mohican Trails Club recently rediscovered a piece of the 3C history. They worked to restore and lay out the new Gorge Overlook Trail, which was originally blazed in the 1930s by the 3C. This makes it Mohican's oldest new trail. In laying out the trail, Mohican Trail Club members tried to follow much of the 3C's nature trail, as it was called. The stone foundation of 2 old 3C shelter houses can be found along this trail. And here's some picnic shelters that are also at Mohican. If you look to the right, that's what it looked like when it was constructed in the 1930s. And then on the left is what it looks like today. And you can see how the forest has really grown up around this shelter. Okay, our next stop is Tar Hollow State Park. The Tar Hollow Resident Camp has some of the most excellent examples of the New Deal Public Works program craftsmanship. Additionally, Tar Hollow is a very quiet park that looks really similar to how it looked in the 1930s. During the Depression, recreation facilities like the Resident Camp facility at Tar Hollow were built by the 3C and the Works Progress Administration. And here's some pictures of this. This facility, I should mention, it does operate as a camp today, so this isn't something where you just want to drop by. You can call the park manager and see if you can arrange a visit. But this structure is considered by some to be the most beautiful log structure in southeastern Ohio. It was built with chestnut logs and stone and has a handmade roof of wooden shingles. The massive stone fireplace, which may be the largest within the park system, was constructed out of native sandstone. The resident camp has been hosting visitors and campers for generations. Thousands of youth, now parents and grandparents, have been loyal to this special place for the memories made and the impact it had on their lives. And like I said, it's still being used as a camp today, which is pretty neat. Okay, and then we're gonna head back to Kyle.
Hello again. So down at Hocking Hills. Hold on 1 second. There you go. Yeah, so I worked down at Hocking Hills, and down there, the CCC, they had a huge impact on the area that around 3 to 5 million people get to experience every single year. The Hocking Hills region, there were 2 CCC camps based out of Rockbridge, Ohio. And then we're going to show that here. So there was Camp 505, which was Camp Hocking, and that was located just above, if you can see my mouse here, just above Conkle's Hollow State Nature Preserve, which is now the Hocking Hills State Forest headquarters. The second camp was Camp 526C, which was Camp Logan, and that was just past Cantwell Cliffs and was one of the 9 African-American camps in the States, right up here. Here is, we're going to switch this to the next slide and show you a photo of Camp Logan. And then after we see Camp Logan, we're going to go over to Camp Hocking. So Camp Hocking actually opened April 1933. It operated for all 9 years that the CCC was active. Camp Hocking was responsible for the numerous additions and improvements all across Hocking Hills State Park, especially in the southern areas, which has Ash Cave, Cedar Falls, Old Man's Cave, and Conkle's Hollow. Much of what they accomplished can actually still be seen today. One first piece of work we're going to talk about that you can still access at Old Man's Cave Gorge is called the Broken Rock Falls Trail. Previously, this waterfall area of the gorge was inaccessible. At the Old Man's Cave section, you can see one of the 2 planned incline tunnels that the CCC planned construction for in '33 when you travel through the long tunnel, which connects hikers from below Old Man's Cave in the lower gorge to the top of the cave, where people can view the breathtaking lower falls waterfall and find those accesses to Broken Rock Falls Trail that leads you to the hidden Broken Rock Falls waterfall, which is right here on your right-hand side. It's just breathtaking. But now we're going to kind of switch over and talk about some of the transportation improvements that the CCC had in that southern area of the park. So when you're in the parking area of Old Man's Cave and you want to go to Cedar Falls or Ash Cave, you can thank the CCC for that short 2 to 4 mile drive from Old Man's Cave to the other areas. Before the CCC, the roads that connected the parks would take some people hours to travel. And that included incline, dirt, gravel roads that winded through the trees next to the dangerous steep cliffs. Much of those hazards and long travels, they've been completely eradicated when the CCC built the section of State Route 374 that connects from State Route 664 to 56, a 4 mile stretch of road there. And along this path, the CCC built 3 vehicle highway bridges, right? One of which you can still see if you sit parked in the small upper parking lot of Cedar Falls, staring out towards the road to your left, you'll still see that there. It'll look a little bit different today with modern improvements, but it's still there. Some more additions to the Hocking State Forest Park. We're going to head back over to Old Man's Cave for a minute. So in 1935, 2 stone arch bridges made the addition to Old Man's Cave thanks to the CCC. They tried to give them a rustic design and to have convincing placements. Here's a photo of an arch bridge at Upper Falls at Old Man's Cave. And then next here's an arch bridge at the Old Man's Cave itself. Excuse me. And at the same time and in the same manner, they also created 9 fireplaces located in convenient areas of that park. And 30 more fireplaces were actually planned in different areas all over the park. This fireplace here on the right is actually over at Cantwell Cliffs. No longer like that today, but they were all over the park areas. Camp Hocking initially built, 63 picnic tables for all the park areas, and 3 of them were massive. They were actually 24 feet long. The rest were 8 feet in length, and that was only really the beginning of building those for 1935. They always took a lot of pride and care in their work, and a lot of this craftsmanship is still shown today, which we've seen throughout this presentation. Along with the construction, we cannot forget they did over 4 miles of telephone line in the area, 1,100 feet of pipeline, so many acres of reforestation, landscaping. They did a ton of stream bank protection, which you'll find throughout the trails in different areas, especially at Cedar Falls. 3 no longer standing stone arch bridges were also constructed at Old Man's Cave in '35, but they were knocked down in later years due to flooding, which happens periodically. Talking more about the work at Old Man's Cave, we can talk about an idea that was eventually thrown out. There were plans, there we go, that were drawn up for a vehicle bridge that would cross over top of the gorge. Right, but they eventually decided on the current route that we have got today that leads to the Hocking Hills State Park campground, where visitors will actually drive around the northeast side of Old Man's Creek just before you're at Upper Falls. Also, the original camping area that was located there was in the flat area on the south side of the gorge above the cliff. And today, that is right where you would be hiking along that Red Gorge Overlook Trail. That's where the original campground was. So with the creation of the roadway around Upper Falls, where you used to have to drive over the creek, it was decided that it would be safer to move the campground away from the cliff edge, and it would also allow more privacy for the campers, seeing as the area it was in before was very flat. It was open ground forested cover, so you could just see everybody through those trees. It's a pretty neat spot today, though. It was hypothesized that the new campground would be able to hold an unlimited number of campers for anyone trying to obtain a last-minute registration for any of the cabins or campsites. being nearly consistently full in the summertime, we can see that that hypothesis was null. Let's see. Even as late as December of 39, the CCC, they were updating work that was already completed, that they'd already done. At the time, they decided on the addition of handrails and improved cement steps instead of just the carved steps. At Old Man's Cave, a hoist powered by a Model T Ford motor was actually installed to help raise and lower materials over the steep cliffs. And that really helped for replacing parts with it being a Model T Ford engine. Many of the improvements that were added to the other parks, as well as Old Man's Cave, for instance, at Rock House, Scantwell Cliffs, Ash Cave, they all actually had incinerators installed that could help with different daily projects. The incinerator would look like this picture here on the left at different areas, and they always varied a little bit depending on where they're at, but that's a typical design for them. In May of 36, steps were constructed that led visitors from the top parking areas down through the Old Man's Cave, which you'll see in this bottom right picture here. And that improved access to the cave tremendously. The construction for those steps was estimated that 90,000 visitors would enjoy it that year, 1936. Today, we can multiply that number by over 50. Let's see, it's also important to note, the men of Camp Hocking, they were proud of the trees they planted, right? They boasted that though they may not be top tier in their sports and other fields, because they would compete with other camps and other CCC groups in that area recreationally, that they were the world champions for tree planting. For example, mid-April of 1936, 33 men of Camp Hocking planted 4,600 trees on just over a 3.5 acre plot in just an hour and 27 minutes. Before Camp Hocking's work, the best times were typically around 500 trees over a longer period of time. Now, they sent a challenge to the world. They were the first champions, and they challenged everybody else to beat them. Many of the pine and other various trees have been planted by the men of the CCC, and actually across the street from the Hocking Hills State Forest headquarters, there's a stand of pines that was planted. Instead of just being more trees in the woods, the men of Camp Hocking actually dedicated the stand, which was right across from their camp, as the Camp Hocking Constitutional Grove. They believed that that grove could stand as a living symbol that ties and preserves American democracy for the citizens of the United States of America. And it's still there today. You can still see that wood system. We're going to switch over to Camp Logan. So Camp Logan opened December 23rd, 1933. Originally, it was not a segregated camp, but that changed by November 1st of 1934. And when that happened, some of the men were displaced and transferred to other camps. But Camp Logan operated for 4 years until May of 1937. Then it was closed, and the men were transferred to Camp Dean, which operated until 1941. This Camp 526C was subject to a name change twice more before it was finally abandoned. The next two names would have been Camp James Lawrence, and then it finally switched to Camp Vesuvius Lake. So the same men were still doing work. They just had a new name, and that's when they shifted focus from the Hocking Parks to the Vesuvius Dam construction further south near Ironton, Ohio. After the abandonment of Camp Logan because of reduced enrollment, Camp Hocking finally was abandoned in May of 1942 as a result of the coming World War II efforts. We're going to take a closer look at some of the improvements the CCC made to the Hocking area. We're going to look at Rock House first. So at Rock House, similar work that's prevalent today that many would not even realize was completed, right? When you leave Rock House Park, you might notice that regardless if you turn left or right outside of the park, you'll drive around a very wide curve, right? In 1936, this curve was incredibly sharp, and you can kind of see that in the pictures here, right there in the top middle. Let's see, so they were tasked with fixing this road because many, many deaths and injuries would happen every year on this very sharp turn. So the old road, it was filled up and reforested. The new road was constructed right near it, but making it a much smoother drive without those sharp turns like there was before. They also added in a turning lane entrance to the park, which was designed to assist with reducing the accidents that people traveling between Rock House and Old Man's Cave would get into. And here are some of the stone steps on the left that were hand carved by the CCC. And you can see in these pictures on the right, the incline leading to Rock House before those steps were carved, right? So the left side, that's current time. The right side is before those steps. So imagine trying to get up that. And if you would take a second and look up here, you'll see people going up this rocky embankment here. They would do it. And this is the bridge that we're crossing at the time that the CCC built. And we've since updated it. But if you go to Rock House today and look underneath that bridge, you'll still see remnants of the old bridge. We're going to move a little further north from Rock House to Cantwell Cliffs, because really every Hocking Hills State Park has benefited from the handiwork of the CCC, except maybe the newly opened Whispering Cave, which opened in 2016, but even a little bit of that's had some influence there. But there's influence in all these parks long after the CCC's been over. In 1938, Cantwell Cliffs had 1,200 people visiting the area alone. That's 1938, right? And that is one of the most difficult areas to get to. The number was so high because of Camp Logan's work. They laid tons of piping. They dug wells so there could be a water supply at many of the different points in the area. The parking area was actually expanded. The wood was always being chopped and left by those constructed fireplaces that we saw earlier so that people could stay warm with it. Walking trails were constructed on the upper and lower rims of the cliffs that have carved stone steps that are still there today. Locations along the trails that connect from the top to the bottom, right? And some of these very steep steps that you'll see here on the left and right, that's all hand carved. A large shelter house was constructed, as well as 2 small side shelter houses in the woods. They even refinished and expanded road construction, so not only did they have a pleasant time in the park, but they had an easy time reaching it. A year earlier, actually, in 1937, at Cantwell, the CCC built over 1 mile of stone steps for the trails. There was 18 footbridges, plus this shelter house you see here, and tons of other little minute details that are evident all over that park if you go out and hike it. So now Camp Logan was shifting focus. They split much of their time, like I said, between Cantwell Cliffs and the project that ended up taking a lot of their priority was the $1 million at the time construction of the Lake Vesuvius Dam. The Lake Vesuvius area was constructed right around 1937 to 1941, and they had a ton of additions there. They had 7 recreational buildings, bathhouses, latrines, a warehouse, a classroom and a museum is down there. And they did offices, as well as this Vesuvius Dam that's right there on your left. It was named after the Vesuvius furnace, which is now in ruins, and that was one of the 69 iron furnaces, which is in the Hanging Rock region, which we're just at the top of, that started from Lake Hope State Park and scattered down about 100 miles. It's also important to note that the CCC did more than just the Hocking parks in the area. Several other natural areas were improved as well. One example is with the stone bridges that were constructed in nearby Rhododendron Hollow State Nature Preserve. That was by Camp Logan in 1936. So many public areas have had CCC influence. It would take days, maybe even weeks, to go over all the work. Some of the other areas, include, we've got Side of the Trail State Park, Lake Hope State Park, Cedar Creek State Park, we've got Cowan Lake. There's just so many more. That picture there in the middle is just some of the different areas, state park specific, that's been affected. But you've got metro parks, national parklands. There's so many places in Ohio that's got CCC influence, and that's just a few of them that are still present today that you can find. So the CCC, they remained in effect until 1942. At that time, the Great Depression had ended, and unemployment dropped tremendously due to the creation of thousands of jobs associated with World War II. The program is really remembered as a tremendous success, which offered support. It boosted morale for hundreds of thousands of the Americans and their families. It sparked a national appreciation for conservation and natural resources, which is so important for us today. It also prepared the country's military and a generation of young men for the challenges they were about to face with the coming World War. Without these men, we might not have these beautiful recreation areas that we've got the privilege of visiting today. Cindy Koss, a Hocking County native and an ODNR employee who's also responsible for a ton of the research on the CCC, especially in the Hocking County, she wrote that, "I am proud to say that their work lives on today. As I hiked through the tunnels chiseled out by the boys of the CCC, I could not help touching the walls. I feel the grooves and wonder how long it took to create this wonderful piece of art. I cannot help to feel a sense of pride in knowing that one of our own local men put his heart and soul into helping develop one of the most visited parks in the United States. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Kyle and Ian. Oh, I hear myself. Sorry. If anybody has any questions that you would like to ask Ian or Kyle, now is the time to type those in the Q&A box before we sign off here. I do just want to mention that if you want to watch any of our, or if you want to learn more about the CCC, we did have an awesome presentation from Dr. Andrew Feit. He was from Shawnee State University a couple weeks ago, and he talked about the African American contributions in Ohio's Little Smokies, which we know today as Shawnee State Park and Shawnee State Forest. That's on our YouTube page if you want to check it out. But and we did have a question come in about a database earlier of names of the staff of the CCC programs. While we don't have a database, I do know that Dr. Feit did talk about some of the names that were found of the men that worked at the camps in Shawnee State Park. So you can find some of that information there. But if we don't have any questions, we will wrap it up. Thanks again, Kyle, Ann, and in the background, Bill and Cindy. This was an awesome presentation. And oh, we do have a question. How many men total served in the CCC in Ohio? Does anybody know the answer to that one? Ann, are you talking? You're muted.
That off the top of my head, to be honest, but it's something I can definitely look into and shoot an email back.
Okay. Yeah, if you put your email in the Q&A there, we'll no, but it won't be public. We'll see it though, and we can get you an answer. We also have another question that came in. Was there an age limit, younger or older, for those that were in the CCC? Ann, do you know? Oh, you're muted again.
Yeah, I think Kyle addressed that in his thing. It was typically men ages 18 to 25 in the beginning, but then it expanded to men ages 17 to 28.
Awesome, thank you.
Alyssa, I think the number that was in Ohio was like 23,000, 23, maybe 8, you know, somewhere around in there. 23,000, I think, is the top number though that was in Ohio. Like Ann said, we can look that up to get an exact number, but I'm pretty sure it's around 23,000.
Okay, great. Thanks, Cindy.
And Alyssa, this is Bill. Interesting from Dr. Feit, his presentation, I remember there was an exception to that age rule. He mentioned that World War I veterans were exempted from that age limit, so they could have been older as well. So, and some participated. This is a real interesting point.
Yeah, good point. We just had another question that came in. I don't know who can take it. Were the black workers paid the same as the white workers? That is a good question.
Yeah, they were paid the same as the white workers. To be honest with you, the camps itself were segregated for about 2 years. And by 1935, all of the camps in our region, which is Region 9, were integrated except 2. And by 1935, they was all, you know, mixed races. So that is something that changed quickly, but all of them were paid the same.
Thank you, Cindy. And thanks for your questions, everyone. It looks like
the only people that were ever paid a little different was some of the officers, like some of the management of the camps. Sometimes they would make a little bit more than that 30. I think the highest I saw was about $47 a month.
Cool. Thanks, Kyle. Well, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. And we hope to see you for some of our future webinars next month. We're going to have, well, like I said, tomorrow's maple syrup production. That's going to wrap up our webinars for February. But we have some fun ones planned for the month of March. We'll be celebrating Women's History Month, and so we will be highlighting women throughout the Department of Natural Resources, working in a variety of different career fields, from wildlife to engineering to, gosh, there's a handful. I can't think of them off the top of my head, sorry. And we'll also have a webinar series on Bigfoot. We did one of these in the fall, and it was very popular. So we are going to cover all the evidence, go on a hunt, and we have some super fun things planned. So you can find those links on our webpage under our virtual programming. So hope you have a great week, everyone.